Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Favourite myths of the porn lobby. As a university student of the early 1960s, I've got fond memories of arguing passionately for the greater freedom of speech. Those were the days when we had to read D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller, around the time that all Blade Law made a living measuring Bondi bikini bottoms and I Dream of Jeannie's navel had to be covered. It was a repressive society, obsessed with sexual minutiae, such as ensuring that, in movie love scenes that included a bed, one foot always remained on the floor. In retrospect, that era had a certain quaint wholesomeness, a Doris Day happy days which vanished around the same time as Orb's ruler. Yet there was a darker side. The treatment of sex as unmentionable meant that it was dirty and shameful. Unmarried mothers were stigmatized. The opposite sex was always an alien species. And if a woman was raped, she must have asked for it. Fear festered in a swamp of ignorance. In my first term at university, one of my fellow freshers came back to college one night in a dreadful state, terrified she was going to get pregnant because she let a young man kiss her. It was surely not surprising that my generation demanded access to information, freedom of speech, and an end to societal hypocrisy about sex. But here I am now, having given notice in Parliament in 1992 of a private member's bill that would restrict the display of certain magazines in public places acceptable to children. The bill was prompted by my anger over People magazine cover showing a naked woman on all fours wearing a dog collar and on a tight leash with the caption, "Cover Girl Wolf, more wild animals inside." This bill was not about censorship. It would have not prevented any adult purchasing any magazine currently available from any outlet, nor, despite claims to the press the contrary, would it have resulted in raids on art galleries which were specifically exempt. The only changes would be that the covers of certain magazines would no longer be displayed publicly, apart from the title across the top, where the covers show degrading images of naked or apparently naked bodies. To the great majority of people who responded to the proposal, it appeared no more than common sense, in a society that wished to allow some parental discretion in children's exposure to pornography. Yet, with some of my contemporaries from the 1960s, it evoked very different responses, ranging from an amused raised eyebrows, "What harm can a little nakedness do to children?" to genuine outrage, "This is the first step towards censorship." When it finally became before the House for debate in 1984, it got talked to death and stonewalled to prevent it from coming to a vote. In a public discussion about the bill, what has been fascinating is the emergence of a number of myths and their propagation as the parameters of the debate. They serve the function of setting up strawman arguments that anti-censorship proponents can knock down quite comfortably. These myths need to be confronted and addressed if Australia is to respond appropriately to the issues. Myth number 1. Opposition to porn is a form of wowserism. People who make this argument tend to see those with a certain concept about pornography as being primarily motivated by prudishness or a desire to stop people from having fun. Yet, much of today's porn is more about misogyny than it is about sex or eroticism. Robert Mann has examined evidence in this area, concluding, at its most innocent, women are treated by the pornographer as a sexual meal prepared for the appetite of the male predator. Very commonly, women are physically immobilized and abused, bound and gagged, trussed, penetrated by metallic objects, mutilated or worse. Very commonly, they are shown to be enjoying their subjection. The classic narrative of mainstream porn is brutal rape, leading to multiple female orgasm, nymphomania, or adoration of the rapist. States Michael Baxter, in a review of research in this area, a worrying trend is the increasing use of violent imagery in pornography. This includes a quintupling of violent sexual imagery in Playboy between 1973 and 1977, and a doubling of the rape scenes in adult movies between 1968 and 1974. During a visit to the Netherlands in 1993 to examine the issue of sexual violence on behalf of the Social Issues Committee, the subcommittee that I was informed by the Dutch police experts who had been examining the subject that the threat of violence and degradation in porn had increased markedly over the preceding 25 years. If in doubt of this, have a look at the list published by the Commonwealth Chief Censor of items subjected for classifications. There is a strong emphasis on violence. on women with extraordinary sexual characters. In my naivety, I thought that 50 Plus was a magazine about older women. On sadomasochism, fetishes such as urination and child pornography, which is technically legal but catered for in magazines that feature teens. Picture and People magazines, which were not submitted to the chief censor at all until the fuss about the woman on a dog sleeve cover, are still routinely classified unrestricted, have specialised in denigrating women. I found them in frequent representations of women as animals or behaving as animals. Images of female subordination, such as a nude woman on all fours being used as a table for men to rest their beers on whilst they play cards, and images of women subjected to various forms of violence, for example, covered in apparent bruises. The language is similarly demeaning. The problem with many of my compatriots from the 1960s is that they still think we are talking about Playboy magazines of 30 years ago. Since then, pornography's come a long way, baby, and Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Well, at least not unless we are into denigration, debasement, and subjugation of women. Myth number 2. Opposition to porn is a middle-class attack on working-class tastes. The publisher of Picture and People magazine, Richard Walsh, claimed in a radio interview that they were good working-class material aimed at young working-class men. Apart from being patronising and, to many working-class men who think such magazines were disgusting, insulting, middle-class generalization about the working class, Walsh's statement was way off target. The market that he aimed for was a somewhat different one. It was men who perceived themselves to be of low social status because their jobs and or environment gave them little support for their self-esteem. What Richard Walsh did was to make them feel better by giving them someone to look down on, no matter how low their self-image is. The male readers of People can reassure themselves that they are superior to half the human race, the female half. A relevant comparison here is the American Ku Klux Klan, which draws its membership from a similar socio-economic group and provides them with the reassurance of feeling superior to blacks. In the same radio report, Patrice Faust stated, "The sex life of the working class is nasty, brutish, and short. Every survey of behaviour, whether it's sexual offences, or marital behaviour, or premarital behaviour, shows that. I've got a dear friend who used to say to me, 'You tell me how a man makes love, and I will tell you the way he votes.' And that is absolutely justified in terms of what we know about class attitude and conduct in sexual matters." Faust cited Miriam Dixon in The Real Matilda as reinforcing this view by arguing that Australian working class men have power only over women. Unfortunately, Patrice Faust's response to the problem was to put down market stuff in down market outlets. In other words, ignore the plight of the working class, seek woman, and hope fervently that this nasty stuff can be kept safely quarantined from nice middle-class society. It is not surprising that there has been a substantial increase in degrading pornography in recent times, especially online porn. As women's roles and options have changed, many men have felt their own careers and self-esteem to be under threat. Degrading and demeaning images of women cater to the insecurities of such males by implying their superiority. Rapists in the 1993 ABC documentary Without Consent did not describe their motivation as pleasure as being sexual, but rather the thrill of exercising power over another human being. Susan Faludi argues that the proliferation of misogynistic imagery to be part of the backlash against women's rights. By accepting such imagery, our society is condoning widespread vilification of females on the grounds of sexuality. If females did have an equal position in society, such vilification would be less serious, but women remain demonstrably unequal, and degrading porn reinforces and entrenches this inequality. Advertisers spend billions of dollars every year trying to persuade us to buy their products, in the firm belief that media images can change human behaviour. We support and encourage the arts in the belief that they have the capacity to uplift and enhance society. In other words, influence people. Yet, we are expected to believe that the increasing deluge of misogynistic porn does not affect attitudes of women. What's going on here? Myth number 3. Research cannot prove that porn is harmful. The argument that research does not show porn to be harmful will no longer wash. There are now a substantial and growing number of large-scale population studies showing clear connections between the availability of porn and the level of sexual violence. In a comparative study of rape states in the United States, Scandinavia, Britain, Australia and New Zealand, John Court found a connection with the availability of porn. He reviewed earlier studies that purported to show otherwise, particularly in relation to Australia, where the uniform crime data actually support the cause for an increase in rape rates after the liberalisation of porn quite convincingly. In the United States, the 8 major men's magazines, Chic, Club, Gallery, Genesis, Hustler, We, Playboy and Penthouse, have sales that are 5 times higher per capita in Alaska and Nevada than in other states such as North Dakota. And rape rates there are 6 times higher per capita in Alaska and Nevada than North Dakota. Overly, a fairly strong correlation was found to be between rape and circulation rates in the 50 states, even with controls for potential confounding variables such as religion, climate, propensity to report rape, and police practices. In a study by Neil Malamuth, people exposed to less than 5 hours of porn over a 6-week period halved their previous assessments of sentences that they thought appropriate for rape. In a later study, Malamuth linked pornography to the level of hostility felt towards women, and found the level of hostility to be a significant predictor of sexual violence. Such desensitization also leads to the increased acceptance of rape myths. After the liberalisation of pornography beginning in the late 1960s, rape rates rose the most in South Australia, the state which was first to liberalise, and, least in Queensland, the state which retained the most restrictions. In New South Wales, between 1975 and 1991, a time when pornography became increasingly available, the level of reported rape increased by 90.6%. In the United States, whilst the overall homicide rate declined, sex-related murders rose 160% between 1976 and 1984 as the availability of pornography increased. The above are only a few examples. The research is extensive. For a more comprehensive interview, see Thompson, a brief but well-researched article with an extensive bibliography, Weaver, a PhD thesis which reviews the literature and has over 140 references, Milton Home for Feminist Overview, It's Seen, and a collection of articles from different research and professional fields, and the report of the United States Attorney General's Commission from the 1986. An examination of the research is enough, one would think, to cause concern about the contribution to porn to hostility towards and violence against women. However, an argument frequently presented in the face of such data is that correlation is not the same as case. Perhaps both of these variables occur together because they are the result of some other factor. That other factor, generally used in such examples, is the relative openness of society. More open cultures, the argument goes, have more pornography and more willingness to report sexual violence. Therefore, there appears to be more sexual violence, although the reporting rate has changed. In Backlash, Susan Faludi states that the US crime statisticians examining the data have widely rejected this argument. However, if the argument was sustainable, then subsequent moves to restrict pornography in already open societies should have no demonstrable effects. Consider then the fact that Hawaii in 1974, restrictions were placed on the sale of pornographic material. Rape figures fell for the following 3 years. The restrictions were then lifted and rape immediately increased. The restrictions were, again in Oklahoma County, adult stores were closed in 1985, and a 20% decrease in the rape rate occurred over the next 5 years, 1985 to 1990. In the remainder of Oklahoma, there was no such law and no decrease in the rape rate. His substantial review of the research literature in psychology led Weaver to conclude that exposure to sexually explicit material results in a genuine loss of respect for female sexuality and self-determinism. How such a loss might operate is a relevant question. Pictures are processed by the right side of the brain, words, an abstract code in print, by the left brain. The latter side deals with the rational and analytical, the former with holistic pattern recognition. We need to be concerned about the impact of the visual, whether photographic or film images on the brain, particularly on the male brain, which recent research indicates has got less connection between its left and right hemispheres than the female brain, and therefore possibly lesser opportunity for the rational left to control the impulses and emotions generated by the impressionistic right. A further point, even many apparently non-violent images of naked women, showing them presented as if in estrus, as if already aroused, and frequently in poses reminiscent of animal sexuality. Human females do not experience estrus, so such poses are a lie. However, they may function to arouse the male, as pornography intentionally aims to do anyway. Who is then left with the real partner to share the experience? Only a magazine or film. Unsatisfied arousal may be displaced as anger and hostility against provocative but unobtainable women. An anthropological perspective on rape was provided by Peggy Reeves-Sanday. Examining 95 separate societies for which rape data was available, she found some 47% of them experienced little or no rape, 17% were unambiguously rape-prone, and the remaining 36% had evidence of rape, but no clear indication of its incidence. Amalgamating the last two categories, Sanday found markedly distinctive and different patterns of behaviour between low rape and rape-prone cultures. Societies with a high incidence of rape encourage men and boys to be tough, aggressive, and competitive. Women take little or no part in public decision-making or religious rituals. Men mock or scorn women's practical judgment. They also demean what they consider women's work and remain aloof from childbearing and rearing. The conclusion is that the way society trains its boys and girls to think about themselves and each other determines to a large extent how rape-prone or rape-free that society will be. In other words, societies that provide negative images of females and female roles are societies which are prone to rape. Pornography specializes in negative images of women. Those who argue that there is no demonstrable connection between porn and rape tend to do a number of things. First, the research they cite tends to be very old stuff, going back to the now discredited Kinsey data of the late 1940s, long before pornography became widely available or feral as it is today. Secondly, they try to single out one or two studies of individuals or small groups, preferably in a laboratory, and then tend to argue, quite legitimately, that it's difficult to generalize from such studies to society as a whole. Recent research tends to focus more on broad-based demographic trends and connections, as I have done here. Third, they demand a much higher level of proof than in other societal research, arguing that it is impossible to prove causality. A connection between a reduction in porn and a decline in rape is not proof that one caused the other. For a long time, tobacco companies were able to get away with this same defence, and they still do in some cases, until the weight of evidence on smoking became overwhelming. Research on porn, although clearly more challenging in looking for psychological rather than physical factors, has gone so far in the same direction that, writing in the New Scientist in 1990, Dr. Mike Baxter stated that it would be a serious mistake to dismiss research on porn as inconclusive, arguing that there must come a time when the demand for conclusive proof gives way to evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Mind you, if absolute proof were to be the yardstick of all social science research, then, as I've mentioned, the thousands of academics engaged on such work should fold their tents and slink away. Human beings are not laboratory rats that can be isolated from all except for one variable. Fourth, they are reassured by some false statistics. Studies alleging a low level of sexual violence in the Netherlands and Scandinavia, where pornography has been widely available, have been based on reported rape rates. In fact, these countries have a low reporting rape rate because it is so difficult to get a conviction. In Sweden, only the most violent rapes go to trial, and of these, there is a 1 in 8 chance of conviction. However, even the reported rape rate is now climbing, a 34.9% increase between 1986 and 1990. Again, studies purporting to show a decline in sexual violence as these countries after the law change tend to ignore the fact that many sexual crimes were taken off the books altogether, or redefined in ways that made getting a conviction far more difficult. Finally, they are unwilling to acknowledge the violence of much porn, preferring to consider it to be just erotica. Myth number 4. Opposition to porn is opposition to free speech and civil liberties. There are several reasons why this is a myth. First of all, there is no such thing in society as untrammeled free speech. We do draw a line at what people can say and write on the grounds of defamation, obscenity and social harm. Proportionately to the number of items submitted, the Commonwealth Chief Censor refuses classification to the more publications on drugs and weapons than on sex. And public speech is only free to those who have access to media control. Secondly, there is a distinction between political speech and harmful vilification summed up by Susan Brown-Miller. Pornography has been so thickly glossed over with the paterna of chic these days in the name of verbal freedom and sophistication that important distinctions between freedom of political expression, a democratic necessity, honest sex education for children, which is a societal good, and ugly smut, the deliberate devolution of the role of women through obscene, distorted depictions, have been hopelessly confused. Third, I'd argue that in a contest between women's right to physical integrity and social dignity, women's rights to be treated as human beings, and the pornographer's right to make a dollar by publishing degrading images of women, then the highest civil liberty which must be practiced by the former, especially in a society where women should suffer social and economic inequality. It is interesting that opposition to pornography stirs up far more emotive defences of free speech than, say, opposition to anti-gay or anti-racial vilification. Again, the historian David Irving was banned from entering Australia to present his view that the Holocaust was a myth, with little public outrage over censorship. Irving's views are repugnant, but why is the denigration of the Holocaust something from which Australia must be protected, when it's always the open season for the denigration of women? The key difference in these other cases is that they don't have a major industry defending them. In the United States in 1984 alone, says Dr. Baxter, the porn industry grossed $8 billion, and it was said to be more than the movie and the music business combined. As a consequence, the industry can, and does, fund public relations firms to establish anti-censorship lobby groups with an apparently civil libertarian rationale, such as the Americans for Constitutional Freedom set up a strategy to discredit the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography in the mid-1980s. Misogynistic porn contributes to the female inequality in two fundamental ways, either of which is sufficient justification for its restriction. In the first place, it is the propaganda of what writers such as Marlene call the war against women. As propaganda, it must be exposed, and as material entrenching attitudes that women are inferior objects to be used, it must be resisted. And one must savour the irony that New South Wales had already introduced legislation to protect homosexuals from sexual vilification, whilst females, who experience a far higher level of vilification and far greater sexual violence, remain unprotected from such speech. Second, and more controversially, I believe that porn also contributes to actual physical violence against women, whether it is the increasingly violence against prostitutes by clients demanding what they've seen in magazines, as reported to the Social Issues Committee by Dutch police experts, or the epidemic of sex murders or rape. Several years ago, I calculated from police statistics that a woman in New South Wales had a 1 in 8 chance of being raped in her lifetime if all attacks are averaged. This conclusion was attacked in critics, but since then, a large-scale national victim survey in the United States has also produced a 1 in 8 literature lifetime event, and in Britain, a major victim survey produced a 1 in 6 average of women who had already been raped. The main problem with with the lifetime estimates is that the risk of rape varies enormously according to demographic and socio-economic factors. My only purpose for using such a figure was to demonstrate the amount of rape, which most people seem to think is quite rare. Of course, porn is not the only cause of rape. Both of them are products of female social inequality and of resistance to female achievement of equality, among other things. Even Patrice Faust, who is outspoken in her support for the availability of porn, has admitted that it is one of the many factors contributing to rape. I'm very puzzled that she should have reported the right to produce and consume violent, misogynistic images as being more important than the right of females to physical integrity, to be free from rape and the fear of rape, the latter alone being a severe constraint on women's social equality. By and large, the women at the front line of sexual violence, the young women who are its primary victims, and those who staff rape crisis centres and refuges, are in no doubt about the connection between demeaning sexual imagery, whether it's porn or advertising, and sexual violence. Rape is widespread, and it is horrifically destructive to its victims, even into the next generation. If we seriously care about providing equal opportunity for females in a modern Western society, it is long past time that we took a careful look at all the images of womanhood that we display to our children, compared to images of men. Andrew Essinghausen gets awarded $100,000 in damages because a photograph with a vague suggestion of his penis is demeaning and degrading. But a multi-billion-dollar industry built on far more explicit images of women is sacrosanct. Educational psychologists have established that the girls experience a significant drop in self-esteem at the age approximately of puberty, a drop that is not paralleled by boys. This is hardly surprising when one examines the image we present to little girls of their future roles: animals on the leash, anorexic clothes horses on the catwalk, and objects for sexual or violent gratification. Little boys see the same images, and they form their own views of female roles. We spend millions and millions on affirmative actions. We profess the horror at racism. We pass laws against the vilification of people of race, HIV status, or homosexuality. But misogynistic visual images are taken for granted. Women are raped, beaten, murdered, but their right to life and liberty is less than the right to profit from or purchase porn. Imagine, if you will, a picture of a naked man in a dog collar on a leash on all fours, genitals all exposed. Not so much a shocking image as it is an odd one. It does not fit the concept of what a man is. Now, imagine a naked Aboriginal man in the same position. The image becomes appalling, a legitimation of racism. Aboriginal people are entitled to be treated with dignity. So, I would argue, are women.